Blake Fielder told Amy she was nothing without him. What happened when he left changed everything. November 2007, London. Blake Fielder was sitting in Pentonville prison, serving time for assault and perverting the course of justice. But even from his cell, he believed he controlled Amy Winehouse's life. He controlled her music. He controlled her creativity. He controlled her soul. Blake had been Amy's husband for 5 months, her obsession for much longer. Their relationship was toxic, volatile, destructive. Everyone around Amy could see it. Everyone except Amy herself. The visits were twice a week. Amy would arrive at Pentonville looking fragile, desperate, lost without him. Blake fed on this desperation. It gave him power. It made him feel important, essential. "You need me, Amy," he would tell her through the prison glass. "Without me, you're nothing. Your music, your pain, your talent. It all comes from us, from what we have together." Amy would nod, tears streaming down her face. She believed him. How could she not? Back to Black, the album that had made her a global star, was entirely about their relationship, about his betrayals, his abandonments, his return. "When I get out," Blake continued, "we'll write the next album together, like we did with the last one. You can't do this alone, Amy. You've never been able to do this alone." But Blake wasn't getting out anytime soon. His sentence had been extended. What was supposed to be months had become over a year. Amy was alone, whether she wanted to be or not. At first, she fell apart completely. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. The paparazzi followed her everywhere, documenting her decline. Every stumble, every slurred word, every moment of weakness was front-page news. Her management was worried. Her family was terrified. Her record label was calculating how much money they might lose if Amy never recorded again. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. Everyone expected her to collapse completely without Blake. But something else was happening behind the closed doors of her Camden flat. Something no one expected. Something Blake definitely didn't expect. Amy started writing. Not the desperate, pleading songs she'd been scribbling in notebooks during prison visits. Not the scattered fragments of thoughts she'd been recording on her phone, hoping to play them for Blake when he got out. Real songs. Complete songs. Songs that came from a place deeper than her relationship with Blake. Songs that came from her alone. She wrote at the piano in her living room, the same piano where she'd written Rehab years earlier. Before Blake. Before the chaos. When her voice was just her voice, not an echo of someone else's influence. The first song came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. She'd been unable to sleep again, staring at the ceiling, missing Blake with the kind of physical pain that felt like hunger. But instead of reaching for her phone to call the prison, instead of writing another letter she'd never send, she walked to the piano. Her fingers found the keys without conscious thought. A melody emerged, simple but haunting. Then words followed. Not about Blake, not about missing him or needing him. About something else entirely. About the person she was becoming in his absence. About the strength she was finding in the silence. About the music that existed in her before he ever touched her life. She played the song 3 times that night. Each time it got stronger. Each time she heard something in her voice that had been missing for months. Something that belonged only to her. The second song came a week later. Then a third. Then a fourth. She wasn't trying to write an album. She was just trying to survive each day without Blake. But the songs kept coming, emerging from the quiet spaces he used to fill with his voice, his demands, his presence. These weren't the tortured love songs that had made her famous. These were something else. They were clearer, stronger, more honest than anything she'd written before. They were songs about discovering who you are when the person you thought defined you is gone. Word started to spread in London's music circles. Amy was writing again. Not just writing, creating something special. Musicians who'd worked with her before were calling, asking if the rumors were true. Was she really working on new material? Could they hear it? Amy said no to everyone. She wasn't ready. This music was too raw, too personal, too new. She needed to protect it from outside influence. From people who might try to shape it into something commercial. From people who might try to make it about Blake when it was finally about her. But she couldn't keep it secret forever. Her manager, Ray Cosber, eventually convinced her to let him hear what she'd been working on. He came to her flat on a gray December afternoon, expecting to hear fragments, demo-level recordings, rough sketches that would need months of work. Instead, Amy played him 8 complete songs, 8 songs that were unlike anything she'd recorded before. They were still unmistakably Amy, her voice, her style, her emotional honesty, but they had a strength, a confidence that her previous work had lacked. "These are incredible, Amy," Ray told her when she finished playing. "Where did they come from?" Amy was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "They came from me, just me, not from missing someone or needing someone or being someone's inspiration. From me." The songs weren't about Blake at all. They were about identity, about creative independence, about the difference between love that nurtures and love that consumes, about learning to trust your own voice when everyone around you has opinions about what that voice should sound like. One song was about the music industry itself, the way executives and managers and even fans tried to control artists, to keep them in the emotional state that produced their best work, even if that state was destroying them. Another was about the media, about being turned into a character in someone else's story instead of being allowed to write your own. But the most powerful song was the quietest one. Amy played it last, her voice barely above a whisper. It was called Without You, and it wasn't about missing Blake. It was about discovering who she was without him, about the relief that came with that discovery. Ray left that afternoon, knowing he'd heard something extraordinary. Not just good songs, but a fundamental evolution in Amy's artistry. These weren't the songs of someone who needed a man to define her creativity. These were the songs of an artist who had finally found her own voice. But Blake was still calling from prison twice a week. He was still telling Amy she needed him, that her music meant nothing without their shared pain, their shared destruction. And part of Amy still believed him. The test came in February 2008. Blake was granted temporary leave for his grandfather's funeral. One day outside prison, one day with Amy after months of separation. Amy picked him up in the morning. They drove to the funeral in silence. Blake kept looking at her, expecting to see the broken, dependent woman who had been visiting him. Instead, he saw something he didn't recognize. Amy looked stronger, different, independent in a way that unsettled him. After the funeral, they went back to Amy's flat. Blake expected to slide back into their old patterns, expected Amy to need his approval, his input, his control over her music, expected her to play him the desperate, longing songs he knew she must have been writing about him. Instead, Amy played him Without You. Blake listened in silence as Amy sang about discovering her own strength, about learning to create from a place of wholeness instead of brokenness, about understanding that real love doesn't require you to lose yourself. When she finished, Blake was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he said, "This isn't about us." "No," Amy replied, "it's not. But your best work is always about us, about our pain, our connection. That's what makes your music special. That's what people want to hear." Amy looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Blake, do you think that's the only reason people connect with my music? Because I'm miserable? I think you need inspiration to write, real inspiration, the kind that comes from real emotions, real experiences. What we have together, that's real. This," he gestured at the piano, dismissing what he just heard, "this sounds like therapy, not music." Amy stood up from the piano bench. For months, Blake's opinion had been the most important thing in her world. His approval had been what she craved more than anything. But listening to him dismiss her new work, hearing him reduce her art to their dysfunction, she felt something shift inside her. "I've written 8 songs since you've been gone," she said quietly. 8 complete songs, not fragments, not ideas, not desperate late-night recordings. Complete songs. "When was the last time I did that when we were together?" Blake didn't answer. "When we were together, I spent so much energy managing our relationship, managing your moods, managing the chaos, that I barely had any left for music. I thought that chaos was inspiration, But it wasn't. It was just chaos. Amy, you're being dramatic. You need me. Your music needs me. Back to Black was about us, and it was your masterpiece. Back to Black was about the pain you caused me. That's not the same thing as needing you for my music, and it's definitely not my masterpiece. These new songs, they're better than anything I've written before, because they come from strength, not weakness. Blake laughed, but it sounded forced. Strength? Amy, look at yourself. You've been falling apart without me. Everyone can see it. The whole world is watching you self-destruct. I was falling apart, Amy admitted, but not because I can't make music without you, because I was grieving. Grieving the end of us, grieving who I thought I was, grieving all the time I wasted believing I needed someone else to make me whole. She sat back down at the piano and began playing another song. This one was called Stronger Than Me, but it wasn't the song from her first album. This was new. This was about learning to stand alone, to create alone, to be complete alone. As she played, Blake's expression changed. He was hearing something he'd never heard in Amy's voice before. Complete confidence. Total artistic control. She wasn't performing for his approval or trying to impress him. She was simply sharing what she'd created. When she finished, Blake was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, his voice smaller than before, "These songs, they're good, Amy. They're really good. I know they are, but they're not about us. They're not about me at all. No, they're about me." Finally, Blake left that afternoon to return to prison. As Amy watched him go, she felt something she hadn't experienced in their entire relationship. Relief. Relief that he was gone. Relief that she didn't need his approval for her music anymore. Relief that she had found herself again. The next morning, she called Ray and told him she was ready to record. Not because she had to, not because the label was pressuring her, but because she had something to say, something that was entirely her own. Blake called from prison that night, as he had every night for months, but this time Amy didn't answer. She was at the piano working on song number 9. Over the following weeks, Blake's calls became more desperate. He could sense something had changed during their day together, but he couldn't understand what. In his mind, Amy still needed him. She had always needed him. Her music had always been about their relationship, their drama, their shared destruction. But Amy's phone calls with friends and family told a different story. She was working constantly, creating at a pace, and with a focus she'd never had before. She was collaborating with other musicians again, something she'd stopped doing when Blake demanded all her creative attention. Most importantly, she was happy. Not the manic, desperate happiness that came from Blake's intermittent affection, but a steady, grounded happiness that came from within. Blake was released from prison in August 2008. He expected Amy to be waiting for him, ready to resume their old patterns. Instead, he found a woman who had spent the past 10 months rediscovering herself. A woman who had written an album's worth of material without him. A woman who no longer needed his approval to feel valid as an artist. Their reunion lasted 3 days. On the third day, Amy played Blake the complete collection of songs she'd written during his absence. 12 songs that chronicled her journey from dependence to independence, from brokenness to wholeness, from needing someone else to define her to finally defining herself. When she finished, Blake was silent for several minutes. Then he said, "You don't need me anymore." It wasn't a question, it was a realization. And for the first time in their relationship, he was right. "No," Amy said, "I don't. And that's the best thing that's ever happened to me." Blake tried to argue, to convince her that she was making a mistake, that her music would suffer without their shared drama. But Amy had heard enough. She had spent 10 months learning to trust her own voice, her own instincts, her own creative vision. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even Blake, convince her to doubt herself again. Years later, after Amy's death, Blake gave an interview to a British tabloid. The interviewer asked him about Amy's music, about his influence on her work. "I used to think she needed me," Blake said, his voice quiet and reflective. "I thought her music came from our relationship, from what we put each other through. I was wrong. Amy's music came from Amy. I was just there when some of it happened. Do you think she was better off without you?" Blake was quiet for a long time. I know she was. Those songs she wrote when I was in prison, they were the best things she ever created. They were better than Back to Black, better than anything we worked on together, because they were completely hers. Why do you think that made such a difference? Because Amy was never meant to be someone's muse. She was meant to be the artist. When I was around, I made everything about us, about our drama, about what I needed from her. When I was gone, she could finally be what she always was, a complete artist who didn't need anyone else to make her music matter. The interviewer asked one final question. Do you regret telling her she was nothing without you? Blake's answer was immediate. Every day. Because it wasn't true. I was nothing without her. Amy was everything, with or without anyone. It just took me being gone for her to remember that. The 12 songs Amy wrote during Blake's imprisonment were never officially recorded as an album, but bootleg recordings circulated among musicians and music lovers who understood they were hearing something special, something that showed what Amy Winehouse could have become if she had continued to trust her own voice, her own vision, her own extraordinary talent. The night Blake returned to prison for violating his parole, Amy sat alone in her Camden flat. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but full of possibility. She walked to her piano and began playing Without You one more time. But this time, she added a new verse. A verse about what it meant to love someone so much that you lost yourself, and then to find yourself again in their absence. About the difference between inspiration that destroys and inspiration that creates. About understanding that needing someone and loving someone are not the same thing. She recorded the new version on her phone, not for Blake, not for her label, not for anyone but herself. It was the sound of an artist who had finally learned to trust her own voice above all others. 3 months later, Amy received a letter from Blake in prison. In it, he wrote, I heard one of your new songs on someone's radio. I didn't recognize your voice at first. It sounded so complete, so sure of itself. I realized I never heard you sing like that when we were together. I'm sorry for making you believe you needed me to be who you are. You were always everything, Amy. I just wish I had been strong enough to see it then. Amy kept the letter, not as a memento of their relationship, but as a reminder of what she had learned about herself. That her voice was hers alone, that her music came from her own depths, not from the chaos others brought to her life, that the strongest songs came from the strongest version of herself. Blake Fielder told Amy she was nothing without him. What he discovered was that Amy Winehouse was everything, with or without anyone. Her music didn't come from her pain or her relationships or her struggles. Her music came from her. And when she finally understood that, she created the best work of her life. The tragedy is that the world never got to hear what Amy might have become if she had continued on this path of self-discovery and creative independence. But for those 10 months while Blake was away, Amy Winehouse showed herself and everyone around her what it looked like when true talent was finally, completely free. If this story of finding your own voice moved you, remember that true creativity comes from within, not from what others bring to or take from your life. The strongest art comes from the strongest version of yourself.